They called it order in Chatham County, Georgia. They called it commerce, discipline, Christian duty. But on January 14, 1856, at Blackwood Plantation, the mask slipped, and the whole machine revealed itself for what it was, a well-recorded crime scene stretched across 1,200 acres, 8 miles south of Savannah. What happened there was not a misunderstanding, not an isolated cruelty, not a regrettable excess. It was the system working exactly as designed. And 2 girls, both about 13 years old, saw that truth with a clarity the adults around them either lacked or refused to admit. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, comment your location below, because some stories were buried on purpose, and they deserve witnesses. Blackwood Plantation specialized in rice. That detail matters. Rice was profit, and profit demanded wet fields, disease, heat, and labor that consumed human bodies faster than the records could dignify. The people who ran such places liked to speak in numbers. Yield, acreage, purchase price, losses. They kept books with careful handwriting and clean margins, as if neat ink could wash moral filth from the page. At Blackwood, the man signing those numbers was Josiah Blackwood, 46 years old in 1856, heir to a plantation dynasty and proud custodian of a business model built on forced labor. He was known locally as respectable. Men like him usually were. His wife, Caroline Blackwood, ran the main house with a colder kind of precision. She valued obedience, silence, and routine. Nothing was to be wasted. Nothing was to be questioned. That included the labor of children. That included the suffering of women. That included death, so long as death did not interfere too severely with output. Into that house came 2 girls in December 1855. In the ledger, they were reduced to a transaction. Twin females, approximately 13, sold as a pair, no surnames worth preserving, no history considered necessary. For this retelling, call them Eliza and Naomi. The names can change, the structure around them does not. They arrived at Blackwood in a wagon with 11 others and stepped into a regime that expected fear, exhaustion, and eventually submission. What Blackwood failed to understand was that the girls were not merely frightened children. They were observant. They were disciplined. They learned quickly because survival had already taught them to. Within weeks, they had mapped the rhythms of the place better than some of the men paid to police it. They learned where the patrols crossed, which doors were locked first, which overseers drank too much, which workers were watched closely, which corners of the estate slipped into temporary blindness after dusk. They said little. Silence made them useful to the house and nearly invisible to the people who thought themselves in control. This is one of slavery's oldest delusions. It believed that because it denied education, it had denied intelligence. Because it imposed silence, it had erased thought. Because it held the whip, it had secured loyalty. It mistook forced stillness for ignorance. It mistook caution for weakness. It mistook the enslaved for spectators in their own torment. Then came January 14th, 1856. That morning, the rice fields were already punishing. Fever had been moving through the quarters. A young woman named Ruth, not yet 20, was working while 6 months pregnant. That fact alone should settle any romantic lie anyone still wants to tell about plantation life. Pregnancy did not protect her. Sickness did not excuse her. Pain did not reduce her quota. In that world, a woman carrying life was still treated as a unit of output. Ruth collapsed in the field. The overseer in charge there was Silas Morehouse, 34 years old, a man whose violence had ceased to be occupational and become personal. Witnesses did not need a sermon to know what he was. Men like Morehouse existed because the plantation system rewarded them. Their cruelty was not a malfunction, it was an investment. When Ruth fell, Morehouse did not call for help. He did not ask whether she was ill. He did not pause at the sight of a pregnant woman sinking into mud and standing water. He moved in with the hard certainty of a man protected by custom, law, and white approval. He kicked her when she did not rise. Then he struck her again. Others in the field heard the impacts. Nobody needed an investigation to know what had happened. The truth was public from the first minute. The only reason it remained unpunished was that the victim was black, enslaved, and legally stripped of standing before the men who claimed to own both her labor and her future. Eliza and Naomi saw it from roughly 30 yards away while carrying water. That distance matters too. It was close enough to witness. Too far to intervene, close enough to remember every movement. Too far to stop the blow from landing. In slavery, helplessness was often engineered with that kind of precision. The system forced people to watch one another suffer so that terror would do part of the work of confinement. Other workers pulled Ruth from the water before she drowned. But the damage had already been done. She lost the baby that night. Infection followed. Within weeks, she was dead. Pause there, because history too often rushes past women like Ruth on its way to larger events, larger names, larger claims. She is filed under incident, under labor loss, under burial, under nothing. But for the girls watching, Ruth was not a footnote. She was the indictment. Her death stripped the plantation of every excuse it had ever used for itself. There was no honorable version of this arrangement, no benevolent master, no disciplined order, only a hierarchy of power resting on organized harm. That night, in the cramped sleeping space assigned to them near the main house, the girls finally spoke plainly to one another, not as servants, not as frightened property, as witnesses, as analysts of a system that had shown its hand too clearly. One truth had become unavoidable. Blackwood would keep producing Ruths. Morehouse would keep walking away from the damage. Josiah would keep counting profits. Caroline would keep the household running. The chapel would keep accepting bodies. The records would remain tidy. And the county would continue calling it civilization, unless someone disrupted it. Not by pleading. Pleading had no jurisdiction there. Not by isolated outrage. Outrage, on its own, dies quickly inside a structure built to absorb pain, and not by a simple personal escape, leaving everyone else inside the same machinery. The girls understood, with a coldness born from necessity, that Blackwood was too large and too organized to be wounded by one act of impulse. Remove one overseer and another would take his place. Punish one man and the plantation would continue. Survival for two would still leave hundreds trapped. So the scale of the answer had to match the scale of the crime. That was the night the plantation signed its own death warrant, though no one in the main house knew it yet. It did not happen with a speech. It did not happen with grand declarations. History often flatters itself with dramatic lines because plain resolve is harder to market. In truth, it began in silence, with two young minds reaching the same conclusion in the dark. This place would not stop on its own. It had to be studied, exposed, and broken. That decision was not innocence. Slavery had already taken innocence. What it left in its place was sharper and more dangerous to the people who believed themselves secure. The girls began to examine Blackwood not as a prison to endure, but as a structure with weak points. Who held influence among the enslaved? Who could keep a secret? Which routes were least watched? How long it took messages to travel? Which habits among the white household were so fixed they had become vulnerabilities? This is the detail people often resist because it unsettles the old lie of passive suffering. The enslaved were not merely waiting for rescue. Many were measuring walls, testing patterns, storing memory like contraband. They were forced into the position of strategists because the world around them had made ordinary childhood, ordinary family life, ordinary moral growth almost impossible. Ruth's death did not create cruelty at Blackwood. It documented it in the open. And for Eliza and Naomi, that was enough. By the end of January 1856, they were no longer simply trying to survive Blackwood Plantation. They were building the first quiet outlines of a reckoning. Remember that. Record it properly. Because systems like Blackwood relied not only on force, but on forgetting. They depended on future generations softening the language, blurring the facts, and mistaking records for justice. But neat records are not justice. They are often only evidence. And evidence, once seen clearly, demands an answer. If you're listening from somewhere beyond Georgia, beyond America, beyond the reach of the old plantation map, comment your location below. Then tell me this. When children are forced to grow sharp inside a cruel system, who should history judge first? The children who resisted it, or the adults who built it? After January 14, 1856, Blackwood Plantation no longer looked the same to the twins. The fields were the same, the mud was the same, the bell still rang before dawn, and the whip still moved faster than mercy. But once Ruth was carried from the rice rows broken, fevered, and fading, the whole estate became something else in Emma and Grace's eyes. Not a prison to endure, a structure to examine, a machine to dismantle. That is the part slaveholding records never admit. They recorded purchase prices, acreage, harvest weight, and punishments. They did not record what the watched were learning about the watchers. By the third week of January 1856, Emma and Grace had already understood the central weakness of Blackwood. Its cruelty was disciplined, but its discipline was repetitive. And repetition is a gift to anyone forced to live under surveillance. Men like Josiah Blackwood called routine order. In truth, routine was exposure. It revealed who moved where, who drank too much, who grew careless at dusk, who trusted locks more than people, and who believed children were too small to matter. That arrogance was not incidental. It was one of slavery's operating principles. It trained white authority to notice labor, not intelligence. Obedience, not calculation. It assumed that if a girl kept her eyes lowered, her mind must be empty. Blackwood Plantation was built on that lie. Emma and Grace let it stand. They had arrived there on December 17, 1855, sold from Charleston as a pair, sorted like useful tools, and assigned to domestic work near the main house. By late January 1856, they had made themselves nearly invisible. Caroline Blackwood relied on them for kitchen service, laundry, cleaning, table setting, lamp care, and small errands between house and quarters. That position gave them something more valuable than comfort. It gave them access. From the rear steps of the main house, they counted the distance to the servants' quarters. From the wash yard, they tracked which stable hands were trusted and which were beaten into silence. From the dining room, while serving coffee, they listened to Josiah speak with overseers about shipment delays, patrol complaints, and neighboring plantations. Information came carelessly from men who believed themselves among servants too frightened to understand. By January 28th, the twins had begun making a map in memory, not on paper. Paper could be found. Fire could erase it. Fear could expose it. So they made the map the old way, the safer way, where many enslaved people stored what power they could, in the mind. They counted 6 armed night patrollers assigned to Blackwood property. 2 rode the northern perimeter before midnight. 2 crossed the east boundary after moonrise. 1 watched the quarters irregularly. 1 drifted between barns, storehouses, and Kennel Road. Within less than 3 weeks, Emma and Grace could identify the sound of each horse and the delay between one patrol pass and the next. They learned where the dark held longest and where lantern light always returned too soon. They also learned Blackwood did not stand alone. That mattered. Slavery was not one man with bad character. It was a cooperative enterprise. Blackwood coordinated security with 3 neighboring plantations in Chatham County. Riders were shared, warnings traveled. Dogs were kept in kennels about 2 miles north of the main house. If anyone ran, the pursuit would not remain local for long. The county patrol out of Savannah could move fast once called, so the twins drew a harder conclusion. One person running alone would almost certainly fail. A small cluster might be caught by morning. If Blackwood was to be struck, it would have to be struck at scale and with timing so exact that the response arrived too late to matter. That kind of thought should never have belonged to girls turning 14. But slavery did not produce healthy childhoods. It produced sharpened ones. It forced children to think like old survivors or perish inside rules written to crush them. Emma did more of the speaking. Grace did more of the watching. That was how it seemed from the outside. In truth, they worked as a single intelligence divided into 2 bodies. One gathered patterns. The other tested them. One spoke only when necessary. The other filled silence with usefulness. Both remembered everything. They began by studying not only guards, but people. That too required discipline. Not everyone at Blackwood could be trusted with even a hint of defiance. Fear had done its work over the years. Some were watched too closely. Some were exhausted beyond strategy. Some had children too young, injuries too deep, or habits too visible. The twins understood this without judgment. Slavery had spent generations manufacturing caution. It would be moral vanity to condemn the wounded for limping. But they also knew others still had a dangerous clarity in them. People who remembered every indignity. People who obeyed outwardly and counted inwardly. People who could hold a secret because secrecy was the only property left to them. The first of those was Isaiah, the blacksmith. He was around 42 in February 1856, and Blackwood had kept him alive for one simple reason. He was useful. Men who could repair hinges, shape tools, mend wagon hardware, and keep ironworking were expensive to lose. The plantation protected his body only to exploit his hands. That is how slavery defined practicality. Emma approached him on February 3, 1856, after dusk, carrying bread from the kitchen as cover. Grace stood watch near the forge entrance. No speech was wasted. "Can you make keys?" Emma asked. Isaiah did not answer at first. The twins were known for silence. Their voices carried weight because they were so rarely used. He studied Emma the way a cautious man studies a spark near dry timber. "Keys to what?" he said. "Every lock in this place." That was the moment hope entered the forge, though it entered dressed as danger. Isaiah understood the scale at once. This was not theft, not mischief, not the ordinary desperation of one person seeking one opening. This was architecture. It was the beginning of a counter-system. He did not receive the full plan. No one did. That was another lesson the twins grasped before many adults would have. Knowledge had to be divided if the work was to survive panic, punishment, or capture. Everyone would know enough to act, not enough to destroy the whole. By the end of February 1856, they had identified the first inner circle. Isaiah, for locks and iron. Sarah, from the laundry, because gossip moved through linen before it moved through law. Jacob, a field driver respected by workers but distrusted by the owners just enough to make him dangerous to both sides. Daniel and Marcus, stable hands who understood horses, wagon noise, and the value of cloth wrapped around a wheel rim. Abigail, from the kitchen, who knew food stores, missing portions, and how to remove supplies so slowly that greed looked elsewhere. Thomas, an older man once connected to boats and waterways before enslavement buried that life under plantation work. This was not romance, this was organization. No speeches, no grand vows, no wasted heroics, only tasks. Who could move unnoticed? Who could carry messages without appearing to carry them? Who knew the eastern boundary well enough to avoid the worst ground? Who could identify those too young or too weak to travel alone? Who could hide food where white eyes never looked because white arrogance called the place filthy, useless, or beneath notice? By March 1856, the operation had shifted from outrage to structure. That month brought a complication. A new overseer, William Crenshaw, sent from Alabama, 38 years old, suspicious by habit and proud of it. He changed patrol timing, ordered random inspections, and disturbed the predictability the twins had been studying. Men like Crenshaw imagined themselves clever because they multiplied fear. Usually they only multiplied hatred. Emma and Grace adjusted immediately. Recruitment slowed, observation deepened, supplies became the priority, small amounts only, a little flour, salt, dried beans, cloth scraps, rope lengths, candle ends, nothing that would trigger quick suspicion, everything hidden in places the plantation's own hierarchy had made invisible, beneath loose boards, in crawl spaces, in wall gaps, near disused structures, in corners no owner ever stooped low enough to inspect. That was the dark joke of Blackwood. The plantation imagined itself all-seeing, yet its own contempt blinded it. It saw labor where it wanted output, punishment where it wanted obedience, and inventory where it wanted profit. It did not see intelligence gathering beneath its floors. Then came April 1856, and with it, the burial. Ruth died after the infection took hold. The child was already gone. The woman followed. She was buried behind the plantation chapel, in ground that had swallowed too many names without record. No sermon could clean that site. No prayer could rescue the guilty from what they had done. Silas Morehouse did not even attend. He remained in the fields, preserving production. Remember that. Systems reveal themselves most clearly in what they do not pause for. At that burial, the twins did not cry where others could see, but something hardened in full. Until then, the plan had been necessary. After Ruth's grave, it became a form of witness, a reply in action, not revenge in the childish sense, but indictment. By May 1856, the network had grown to 43 people. Most still did not know the full design. They only knew to remember routes, collect small provisions, wait for signals, and trust that something larger than daily suffering was being built beneath the plantation's routine. And it was. The lie of Blackwood was that everything inside it belonged to the master. The truth, by the spring of 1856, was already more dangerous. The plantation was being studied from within by the very people it claimed to own. Every lock was being counted, every guard was being measured, every lie was being catalogued. The house still stood, the fields still filled each morning. Josiah Blackwood still believed himself in command, but command had already begun to shift. He just did not know it yet. By June 1856, Blackwood Plantation was no longer merely a site of forced labor. It had become something its owners never imagined possible, a place under silent internal surveillance by the people it claimed to control. The main house still issued orders, The fields still swallowed bodies under the Georgia sun. The ledgers still balanced profit against loss as if human pain could be reduced to arithmetic. But beneath that performance of authority, another structure was taking shape, careful, hidden, and disciplined. This is where the old plantation myth collapses completely. Slaveholders liked to believe resistance came only in panic, in isolated flight, in the desperate act of one person driven to the edge. That lie protected their vanity. It allowed them to dismiss the enslaved as reactive, emotional, incapable of strategy. But by the summer of 1856, at Blackwood, strategy was exactly what had begun to replace fear. Emma and Grace understood something most of the adults ruling that estate never did. A system built on routine can be studied, and a system that can be studied can be broken. Not easily, not cleanly, but broken nonetheless. By the first week of June, the core network inside Blackwood had spread beyond the blacksmith's forge, the laundry yard, and the kitchen. It reached the rice fields, the mule sheds, the smokehouse, the boat landing routes, and the cabins nearest the eastern tree line. The plantation still looked orderly from the outside. That was the point. Disorder would have exposed them. What they built had to live inside the routine until routine itself could be turned against its masters. The twins never called it a rebellion. That word was too loud, too careless, too likely to get someone killed before the real work was ready. In practice, it was an underground command system built under the nose of the plantation. Every person had a narrow task. No one held the whole design except the girls. Isaiah, the blacksmith, had by then fashioned rough impressions of keys for several locks across the estate. Not perfect duplicates. Good enough. The smokehouse. The side storage room near the stable. The chain cabinet kept by Overseer William Crenshaw. A rear service door of the main house used by domestic workers before dawn. He worked slowly because haste leaves marks, and marks get questions. Questions, on a plantation, often ended in blood. Abigail, from the kitchen, measured food theft the way an accountant measures risk. A handful of cornmeal here, salt there. Scraps of cured meat wrapped and hidden before reaching the master's table. Enough to prepare for movement, never enough to trigger a kitchen inventory. White households often imagined enslaved women too burdened by service to think politically. That mistake has stained history for generations. Abigail proved otherwise. She understood that no mass escape, no organized flight, no movement of the weak and the elderly could survive on courage alone. Courage without supplies becomes tragedy by dawn. Thomas, older than most and once connected to the waterways before enslavement erased his legal identity, became the network's mapkeeper without ever touching a map. He knew which creeks fed toward the Savannah River, which marsh paths could hold a wagon wheel, which lowland areas turned deadly after heavy rain, and which direction gave the dogs trouble. He had the bearing of a man slavery had tried to age into obedience and failed. Then there were the field hands, more important than the owners ever admitted. Plantations depended on their exhaustion and ignored their intelligence. That was a fatal miscalculation. Men like Jacob, Moses, and Eli moved through the widest spaces on the estate. They heard what overseers said when they thought only labor was present. They saw where fences weakened. They noticed which boys were strong enough to help carry children and which women would need support if the time ever came to move quickly. They were not passive bodies in a field. They were gathering facts while pretending not to hear. By mid-June 1856, the network had developed its first serious rule. No one was to act from anger alone. That principle deserves attention because it separates survival from strategy. Anger was easy at Blackwood. Anger met them every morning. In the fields, in the kitchen, in the stable yard, in the chapel where scripture was twisted into discipline, in the ledger where births and deaths were recorded with the same emotional weight as broken tools. But anger, when used carelessly, alerts the oppressor before the oppressed are ready. Emma and Grace understood that. They were not looking for a dramatic gesture. They were building capacity. By July 1856, the network had expanded to nearly 70 people, though most did not know that number. That, too, was deliberate. One of slavery's ugliest legacies is the way it trained people to survive under interrogation. The less any one person knew, the less could be taken from them under pressure. Knowledge was compartmentalized. Routes, not intentions. Supplies, not dates. Names, only when necessary. Messages traveled through ordinary acts. A shirt hung twice meant one thing. A broken bucket left upright meant another. A kitchen rag tied on the rear rail before sunset meant a patrol pattern had changed. A hymn sung half a verse too slowly during evening worship was enough to tell certain ears that the dogs had been moved north. Slaveholders heard spiritual language and assumed surrender. Very often they were listening to logistics. Do not sentimentalize that ingenuity. It was not charming. It was forced. Human beings should never have had to become this careful merely to seek control over their own movement. Yet under systems of domination, intelligence often survives in coded form because open speech is punished first. In late July, trouble nearly broke the network. A young stable hand named Noah, not yet 17, was caught with extra rope hidden beneath feed sacks. Overseer Crenshaw questioned him publicly, not because the rope itself proved anything, but because men like Crenshaw sensed disobedience the way hunting dogs sense weather. Noah kept his nerve. He claimed he had taken it to mend a broken fence latch near the south line. The explanation was plausible, dull, and forgettable, the kind of lie most likely to live. Crenshaw struck him anyway and ordered closer inspection of the stable over the next several days. That moment exposed the risk of growing too quickly. Emma ordered a full pause. No new recruitment for 12 days. No supply movement. No after-dark gatherings larger than 2. Isaiah was to produce nothing. Abigail was to remove nothing extra from the kitchen. Thomas was to speak to no one outside his existing circle. It was a hard order, especially for people living under constant harm. Suffering creates urgency. Urgency tempts mistakes. But discipline is what keeps resistance from collapsing into a warning story told by the oppressor. The pause saved them. Crenshaw found nothing because there was nothing new to find. The plantation relaxed again by early August 1856, not because it had grown kinder, but because arrogance had resumed its natural position. White authority often mistakes the absence of visible defiance for genuine control. It sees calm and assumes submission. In truth, calm is often just preparation under better management. When the network resumed, it resumed with sharper purpose. By August 10th, Emma and Grace had shifted from gathering people to categorizing movement. This was the transition from hidden anger to operational planning. Not everyone would travel at the same speed. Not everyone could take the same route. The elderly, the sick, mothers carrying infants, children under 5, injured men from the fields. These realities mattered more than grand ideas. If the plan could not carry the vulnerable, then it was not liberation. It was selection. The girls would not permit that, so groups were formed in layers. The strongest walkers would move first and guide. The wagon teams would carry those least able to endure the marsh road. Pairs were assigned to every child too young to understand silence. Women with nursing infants were placed closest to the supply carriers. Older men who knew the tree lines would serve as rear watchers. It was not chaos. It was administration, better and more moral administration than anything Blackwood's owners had ever practiced. That is another truth worth stating plainly. The enslaved were often forced to govern with more humanity than the people who held legal power over them. By August 21st, 1856, the network included over 100 people directly or indirectly prepared for coordinated action. Others remained outside the inner structure but could be gathered quickly once the signal came. Emma and Grace still refused to name a final date. Conditions were not ready. Locks were not fully solved. The eastern route remained uncertain after rain. And one fact continued to shape every decision. If this failed, Blackwood would not simply punish the planners. It would punish everyone it could reach. That is why moral judgment in stories like this must be handled honestly. People sometimes ask why the enslaved did not rise sooner, speak louder, run faster, strike back more openly. The question is often asked from the comfort of rights they did not possess. It forgets what retaliation looked like in 1856 Georgia. Collective punishment, sale, family separation, public humiliation, extended confinement. Permanent disappearance into another county, another state, another ledger. Caution was not cowardice, it was responsibility. By the end of August 1856, Blackwood Plantation contained 2 ledgers. One sat in Josiah Blackwood's office, bound in leather, listing births, cotton accounts, rice shipments, equipment losses, and the market value of human beings he believed belonged to him. The other had no paper and no binding. It lived in memory, whispers, gestures, and guarded trust. It contained routes, signals, food stores, forged keys, movement assignments, and the names of people who had decided that suffering in silence was no longer the same as surviving. The first ledger measured ownership. The second measured resolve. Only one of them deserved to endure. And by then, though the master did not know it, the second was already stronger than the first. By September 1856, Blackwood Plantation had become a trap for the wrong people. For months, Josiah Blackwood believed he still ruled by ledger, bell, and routine. He believed the quarters were quiet because fear was working. He believed the fields were productive because discipline was effective. He believed the main house remained secure because the locks were his, the doors were his, the horses were his, and the lives inside that estate were his to arrange. Men like him always confuse possession with control. They think ownership means obedience. It does not. It only means the crime has been legalized long enough to look ordinary. By the second week of September 1856, Emma and Grace had stopped asking whether Blackwood could be breached. That question was finished. What remained was timing, sequence, and cost. The network had grown beyond rumor and beyond instinct. It had become operational. More than 300 people were now within reach of the plan, though only a narrow inner circle knew how close the date had come. The plantation still functioned in daylight exactly as before. Rice moved. Orders were shouted. Horses were brushed down. Meals were served in the main house. Prayers were recited over stolen labor as if heaven had signed the contracts. The lie remained intact on the surface. Beneath it, every key point of movement had already been assigned. The final obstacle was not courage. Courage had been present since January 14th, the day Ruth collapsed in the field, and the plantation showed its true face without shame. The final obstacle was coordination. Too early and the patrols would close the roads. Too late and someone careless, frightened, or desperate might expose the structure before it moved. The difference between deliverance and catastrophe often rests on one detail no master ever bothers to learn. The oppressed must be more precise than the people oppressing them. That precision sharpened after September 12, 1856, when William Crenshaw ordered an unexpected sweep through the storage sheds and stable yard. He had no proof of anything substantial, but suspicion, in such places, did not need proof. It only needed appetite. Crenshaw found nothing that day except a missing length of harness leather and a misplaced grain hook. Still, the inspection forced Emma and Grace to accelerate the last phase of preparation. The signal date was set for September 23, 1856. Why that night? Because the conditions aligned. The moon would be dim enough to conceal movement, but not so dark that families would lose one another in the marsh paths. Josiah Blackwood had invited 2 neighboring planters to dinner at the main house, which meant extra candles, extra wine, extra distraction, and a false sense of security. The kitchen would be under strain. The household servants would be moving constantly. The overseers would assume the greatest threat to order was clumsiness during service, not the collapse of the plantation itself. In other words, white vanity would be busy entertaining itself. That was the weakness Emma intended to use. On September 20th, the last instructions moved through Blackwood in fragments. No speeches, no declarations. Only simple directives. Travel light. Carry no metal that clatters. Wrap infants before moonrise. If separated, move east. If challenged before the signal, deny everything and wait. If the kitchen bell rings twice after dark, the plan is dead. If no bell rings, keep moving. Isaiah prepared the final keys. Abigail began reducing supper stores in amounts small enough to pass for kitchen confusion. Thomas rechecked the eastern route toward the marsh road leading eventually to the Savannah River crossing. Jacob and Moses assigned the strongest men to wagon positions. Sarah spread word among the women nearest the quarters. Be ready to leave bedding, leave pots, leave anything that slows the body. Slavery had already taken enough. No one would be asked to carry its debris on the way out. By the afternoon of September 23, 1856, the estate looked ordinary to anyone with an interest in being deceived. The rice fields emptied toward dusk. The house lamps were trimmed. Caroline Blackwood supervised table settings with the same cold attention she gave every dinner. Silver was polished. Glasses aligned. Servants moved in soft shoes across waxed floors while outside, in cabins and work sheds and behind the stable wall, hundreds of lives stood on the edge of irreversible motion. This matters. The operation was not a burst of rage. It was administration under pressure. That is what slavery's defenders never want remembered. They want resistance to look wild so that oppression can continue calling itself civilized. But on that night, civilization was in the quarters and the yards, among the people organizing care, transport, silence, and timing. Barbarity was seated at the Blackwood table, waiting for supper. Dinner began shortly after 7 p.m. The guests were Edwin Pritchard from a plantation west of the county line and Samuel Haynes, a merchant with shipping interest near Savannah. Both men had grown comfortable eating off systems they did not need to inspect too closely. Roast fowl, rice cakes, molasses glaze, wine from Charleston. Beneath the table, they discussed market instability, labor management, and the coming harvest, as though the bodies making that harvest possible were part of the weather. Emma and Grace served the room without visible haste. That was the final insult to Blackwood. The system would fall while still being attended to by the very girls it had reduced to household labor. At approximately 8:10 p.m., Isaiah used the first forged key on the side storage lock near the stable. At 8:17, Daniel and Marcus drew out the first wagon, wheels wrapped in cloth to soften sound over packed ground. At 8:24, Sarah moved the first cluster of mothers and children from the outer cabins toward the tree line. At 8:31, Jacob opened the rear gate, usually secured after sundown. No alarm was raised. The patrol rotation was between passes exactly as the twins had predicted, and still the house dined. By 8:40 p.m., nearly 60 people had already left the nearest quarters and begun moving east in staggered groups. The oldest and weakest were placed in wagons first. Children were carried or led hand to hand. No one was permitted to run unless discovered. Running makes noise. Panic unravels structure. Emma had forbidden it unless the line broke. That order held. At 8:47, the second storage door opened. More supplies came through: cornmeal sacks, dried beans, blankets, water containers. Abigail slipped from the kitchen long enough to send the signal that the dining room remained occupied. Caroline had ordered a dessert course. That bought them more time. This is where the record often gets softened with phrases like confusion, commotion, unfortunate fire. Do not accept that language. What happened next was chosen. The kitchen fire began shortly before 9 p.m., not a blaze thrown wildly for spectacle, not reckless destruction, a controlled ignition where heat, grease, fabric, and timber would do what the plantation's own architecture invited them to do. The old kitchen wing was vulnerable, dry in the right places, cluttered in the wrong ones, and close enough to the service corridor to draw every white authority toward preservation of property. The point was not simply to burn. The point was to redirect attention at the decisive moment. Smoke reached the rear hall first. A pantry girl shouted. Then came the crash of dropped dishes, the chair legs scraping, Caroline's voice turning sharp, Josiah demanding answers before he had any. White households in such moments reveal their true hierarchy. Not people first, buildings first, ledger first, silver first, horses first, image first. The enslaved were expected to become emergency labor even while seeking freedom from the same house now calling for help. But the labor did not return. That was the shock. Servants vanished from doorways where they should have been. Stable hands were nowhere they were supposed to be. Men sent to fetch water discovered missing wagons, open locks, and cabins emptying toward the east edge of the property. By the time Crenshaw understood that the fire was not the disaster but the cover, the plantation had already begun to empty itself of its stolen workforce. Then the panic became honest. Blackwood was no longer protecting dinner guests. It was chasing the collapse of its own authority. Crenshaw mounted up with 2 patrolmen just after 9:10 p.m., but smoke had already spread across the kitchen roofline, drawing others back toward the house. Josiah shouted contradictory orders. Save the ledgers, move the horses, watch the quarters, get the guns, put out the fire, find the servants. The whole logic of mastery fell apart in real time because mastery had always depended on the cooperation of the people being mastered. Remove that cooperation, and the master is only a frightened man in a burning house. By 9:20 p.m., more than 200 people were beyond the first line of pursuit. By 9:35, the number had risen further as those from the far cabins joined the movement. Thomas guided the lead groups through the marsh approach. Daniel and Marcus kept the wagons aligned. Jacob and Moses managed the rear clusters and prevented bunching at narrow passages. Emma and Grace moved between positions, checking children, counting heads, redirecting stragglers, refusing to let urgency become disorder. This is the detail worth preserving with moral clarity. When the plantation was under pressure, the enslaved organized human life. The owners organized property. One side acted like a community, the other acted like a claim. Flames climbed higher behind them. The kitchen wing glowed against the Georgia night. The smoke became visible above the trees. Somewhere back at the main house, Josiah Blackwood must have realized the truth too late. The fire had not destroyed his plantation. The plantation had destroyed itself long before. In every field, every cabin, every punishment, every grave, the fire merely announced the verdict. By the time the county understood what had happened on September 23, 1856, Blackwood was no longer a sealed estate. It was evidence. By dawn on September 24, 1856, the story had already begun to split in two. One version came from the white men of Chatham County, Georgia, planters, deputies, patrol captains, merchants, and clerks who needed the event at Blackwood Plantation to sound like disorder. They called it theft, arson, conspiracy, agitation. They spoke the language of property because property was the only language their system respected. They did not say that hundreds of human beings had seized a narrow opening in the night and stepped through it with more discipline than the men who claimed to own them. They did not say the plantation itself had trained them in timing, silence, and endurance. They did not say the fire had only exposed what Blackwood had been all along, a fragile empire resting on terror and routine. The second version moved through the marshes, the river crossings, the hidden wagons, the whispered counts of missing and safe. That version did not flatter anyone. It named the weak who had to be carried. It named the children who nearly cried out. It named the old men whose legs gave way in wet ground and were lifted by others. It named the women who kept walking after losing too much already. And somewhere inside that moving darkness were two girls, Emma and Grace, both still only 13, who had just done what the law of Georgia considered impossible. They had turned a plantation into a scene of public failure. The county responded exactly as such counties always did when their authority was embarrassed, not with reflection, not with remorse, with pursuit. By 6 a.m., messengers had already gone out from Blackwood toward neighboring plantations and into Savannah. Riders carried descriptions. Numbers shifted wildly with every retelling. One said 100 had fled, another said 200. By noon, Sheriff Robert Talbert was hearing estimates closer to 347. That number shocked them not because of the suffering involved, but because of the insult. A few people fleeing could be blamed on desperation. Hundreds fleeing exposed structure. It suggested planning. It suggested intelligence. Worst of all, it suggested that the enslaved had seen through the system more clearly than the men administering it. Talbert was 51 years old in 1856, a county officer formed by habit, hierarchy, and the slow corruption of daily compromise. Men like him liked to imagine themselves practical. They did not invent the plantation order, they told themselves. They merely kept peace around it. But peace built around captivity is not peace. It is paperwork serving cruelty. Talbert knew that if Blackwood's escape spread in rumor before the county controlled the story, other plantations would begin to look less secure. Fear could travel both ways. So the search widened. Mounted patrols moved along the roads east of Blackwood. Dog handlers were summoned from the kennels north of the property. Deputies checked ferry points, warehouse alleys, abandoned cabins, and known crossings near the Savannah River. Notices were drafted. Questions were put to poor whites who had seen unusual wagon movement before dawn. Every authority the county possessed was deployed, not because justice demanded it, but because the spectacle of control had to be restored. And still, the first pursuit failed. That failure mattered. The marsh routes slowed the dogs. The staggered movement of the escape groups confused the riders. Some traveled by wagon for short stretches, then on foot. Others doubled back before cutting east again. A few smaller clusters intentionally left traces in the wrong direction. This was not panic in the woods. This was design under pressure. The county did not want to admit that. A system built on racial arrogance cannot easily confess that it has been outplanned by the people it calls inferior. Talbert began his inquiry at Blackwood itself on September 24th, starting where law always starts when power is embarrassed, with the assumption that a man must be behind it. He questioned Josiah Blackwood in the ruined shadow of the kitchen wing. Blackwood was exhausted, smoke-stained, furious, and humiliated, the most dangerous condition for a man accustomed to command. He blamed outsiders first, abolitionist interference, river smugglers, agitators from the north. He named every distant enemy before confronting the truth nearest at hand. The people inside his plantation had organized under his nose for months. That possibility offended his pride more than the fire offended his estate. Talbert then questioned William Crenshaw, who provided what men like him always provide when failure threatens their standing: confidence without clarity. He said the operation bore signs of male planning. Strong hands, stable access, root knowledge. He insisted no child or house servant could have directed it. That was not evidence. That was prejudice speaking in the tone of certainty. This blindness protected Emma and Grace for a while. The investigators looked first at black men with skills. Isaiah the blacksmith rose quickly on the list of suspects. So did Jacob, because he held influence in the fields. So did Thomas, because someone had clearly used waterway knowledge. Talbert was not stupid, only trained within a stupid system. He could see complexity, but only in the people his world had taught him to fear. He did not think to search for discipline in young girls carrying trays through the main house. That is how oppressive systems often fail. They do not simply rely on force, they rely on habits of contempt, and contempt narrows vision. By September 26th, arrests had begun, not many at first. A handful caught on the wrong road. 2 elderly men unable to keep pace with the main body. A mother and child discovered in a tobacco shed after turning south by mistake. A wounded teenager dragged back from a creek line. These captures were described in county notes as recoveries, as if livestock had been returned to inventory. Language is never innocent in such records. It launders sin by changing nouns. Those brought back to Blackwood were questioned under pressure. Talbert wanted names. Crenshaw wanted confession. Blackwood wanted someone significant to blame, someone large enough to restore his image by punishment. But the structure Emma and Grace had built now did its second job. Because knowledge had been divided, no single person could expose the whole design. Some knew routes, some knew supplies, some knew one contact, 2 at most. The county was chasing a structure it could not fully see because the planners had understood, long before the pursuit began, what capture would look like. By October 1st, 1856, the search entered a new phase. The county stopped asking only who had escaped and started asking who had planned. That change was a confession in disguise. Random flight does not require countywide investigation. Mass movement, timed with fire and lock access, does. Talbert reviewed stable records, tool access, food shortages, servant assignments, patrol gaps, and testimonies from neighboring plantations. He sent inquiries toward Bryan County and Liberty County in case groups had passed through their roads. He consulted ferrymen. He pressed informants. He even listened to one dock worker in Savannah who claimed that some of the fugitives seemed guided. The word bothered him. Guided implied leadership. Leadership implied minds at work. And minds at work inside a plantation were more threatening than any single act of escape. Yet the clues still pointed in the wrong direction. Every assumption of the investigators leaned upward in age and outward in gender. A blacksmith, a preacher, a teamster, perhaps an outside abolitionist, perhaps a free black sailor moving secretly along the river. The idea that 2 enslaved girls had coordinated timing, compartmentalization, trust, and movement for hundreds was too offensive to the county's worldview to be considered early. So for months, the truth survived under the cover of racism itself. Some escapees reached safer ground almost immediately. Others did not. That must be said plainly. Mass escape is not clean. It never was. Some were recaptured in the days after Blackwood. Some vanished into the wet geography between plantation and river and were never properly accounted for again. Some likely reached networks beyond Georgia. Others almost certainly perished unnamed, somewhere between terror and dawn. Histories that smooth such events into triumph do a different kind of violence. Freedom pursued under armed law always carries a ledger of the missing. Still, enough had gotten through to make Blackwood a scandal. By November 1856, newspapers in Georgia were speaking cautiously of an extraordinary plantation breach without printing the full scale. Planters whispered more than editors wrote. Insurance men asked questions. Patrol systems were reviewed. New rules were proposed for quarter checks, food accounting, and domestic oversight. White Georgia did what guilty systems do when exposed. It called for more control, not less. It treated the symptom as a security problem and the disease as normal business, but the story refused to stay buried. A thread of testimony moved north with survivors, and by April 1857, statements taken in Pennsylvania from black refugees and abolitionist contacts began sketching the outline of what had really happened. The details arrived in fragments: a plantation near Savannah, a dinner distraction, a kitchen fire used as cover, forged keys, divided groups, marsh routes, a planning method so careful it did not resemble the fantasies Southern papers liked to publish about outside agitators. And then came the detail that shattered the remaining assumptions. The planners, according to converging testimony, were not seasoned male conspirators. They were two girls, not symbols, not mascots, not accidental helpers carried along by stronger hands. Planners. Emma and Grace, whether those were their true names or names adopted later for protection, had used the plantation's contempt as concealment. Their age had protected them because the white imagination was too arrogant to read them correctly. They had moved through the house, the kitchen, the yards, the quarters, and the patrol patterns as if gathering chores, when in fact they were gathering evidence. That should disturb anyone still tempted to romanticize authority. Two children understood Blackwood more truthfully than the men legally charged with running and policing it. The county had armed riders, dogs, ledgers, warrants, and law. The girls had memory, discipline, and a moral clarity sharpened by witnessing Ruth's death. In the end, the county's tools looked impressive and thought shallow. The girls' tools looked small and proved devastating. By spring 1857, Sheriff Talbot had no satisfying resolution to offer. He could arrest bodies. He could draft reports. He could reassure planners that measures would be strengthened, but he could not undo the deeper damage. Blackwood had entered local memory not as a noble estate restored to order, but as a plantation publicly exposed by the people it tried to own. That is the judgment history should preserve. Not merely that many escaped, not merely that the county searched and failed in part, but that a system built on certainty was outwitted by those it had dismissed. That organized cruelty, however grand its house, remains vulnerable to the intelligence of the condemned, and that whenever official records speak more tenderly of burned property than broken lives, they indict themselves more thoroughly than any witness ever could. By April 1857, the men who had tried to reduce Blackwood Plantation to a story of fire and disorder were already losing control of the record. The plantation still stood in damaged form. The ledgers still existed. Josiah Blackwood still spoke as if ownership had been interrupted, not morally exposed. Sheriff Robert Talbot still filed reports in the language of pursuit, containment, and loss. But outside Georgia, another archive was forming, less polished, more honest, and far harder to silence. It was built from testimony. That is what oppressive systems fear most in the long run. Not just escape, not just disruption. Testimony. The moment the injured begin to describe the machinery clearly, the old excuses start to rot. And by the spring of 1857, survivors connected to the Blackwood escape had begun doing exactly that through abolitionist contacts moving between Philadelphia, New York, and smaller anti-slavery circles in Pennsylvania. Fragments came first: a plantation south of Savannah, a kitchen blaze used as diversion, wagons moved under cloth, dogs misled by broken routes through marshland, a large number gone before dawn. The pattern kept pointing back to one unbearable conclusion for the Georgia planter class. This had not been panic. It had been organized intelligence. And inside that intelligence stood two girls the county had failed to read correctly. Call them Emma and Grace. Perhaps those were not the names given to them at birth. Perhaps they chose new ones later, as so many fugitives did when distance became the first form of self-recovery. The exact names matter less than the fact of their existence and their work. Too much history has already been spent protecting the reputations of men like Josiah Blackwood, and not enough preserving the strategies of the people he tried to erase. By May 1857, Blackwood had become a place of suspicion even to itself. Surviving workers were watched more aggressively. Food stores were checked. Domestic servants were rotated. Locks were replaced. Patrols expanded. Neighboring planters exchanged warnings and acted as though new hardware could repair an old moral collapse. That is how such systems behave. They answer exposure with tighter procedure, never repentance. They search for better chains instead of questioning why chains exist at all. But suspicion has a habit of eventually reaching the truth, even when the truth first arrives disguised. By June 1857, whispers had begun circulating in Chatham County that the house girls had known more than they appeared to know. One driver claimed he had seen Emma crossing too often between the kitchen and outer sheds in the weeks before the escape. Another servant, pressured after recapture, spoke of Grace noticing patrol hours with unnatural accuracy. None of this was proof by legal standard, but on a plantation, proof was often irrelevant. Suspicion alone could reopen danger. The twins understood that. Remaining in Georgia was no longer survival, it was delay before seizure. Their advantage after Blackwood was that confusion had made them useful in the aftermath. Because they had not been caught among the first large groups leaving east on September 23, 1856, and because their age and domestic status had initially shielded them from direct accusation, they remained near the edges of suspicion rather than at its center for several months. That bought time. Time for the hunted is often more valuable than food. By July 1857, a route out had begun to form through people who existed in the cracks between commerce and conscience. There was Elias Whitmore, a trader on paper, something more complicated in practice. Officially, he moved goods and occasionally handled slave sales between Georgia and the Carolinas. Unofficially, according to later accounts, he had become a quiet intermediary for anti-slavery contacts willing to exploit the slave market's own paperwork against itself. Such figures did not fit cleanly into moral categories. Some made money in one world while feeding another. History prefers pure heroes and pure villains because impurity is harder to narrate. But systems this ugly are often breached by compromised people making one decent decision in a corridor of indecency. Through Whitmore and a black dock worker connected to contacts further north, a plan emerged. The girls would disappear not as fugitives, but as transferred property. That is the bleak irony at the center of so many freedom routes in the 1850s. To escape the ledger, one often had to pass through it again. On August 11, 1857, papers were drawn indicating that 2 young enslaved females from the Blackwood estate were to be sold onward through a broker with interests linked to Norfolk, Virginia. Whether Josiah Blackwood signed willingly, out of suspicion, or simply out of financial convenience remains unclear in the surviving story. Men like him often solve discomfort through sale. If a person seemed troublesome, move the problem. Convert tension into cash. Let another county inherit the consequence. Slavery called this management. In truth, it was the trafficking of accountability away from the scene of the crime. The girls were placed on a transport line under guard, but the transfer was false in its final purpose. Somewhere between the coastal route and the northern connection point, likely through assistance arranged near Baltimore, the sale chain was broken. Not with grand drama, not with a public rescue scene staged for memory, quietly, efficiently, a change of escort, a document redirected, a wagon not arriving where the seller expected. By the time Georgia interests realized the transfer had gone wrong, Emma and Grace were no longer moving deeper into the slave market, they were moving out of it. By late August 1857, they reached Philadelphia. Do not imagine triumph arriving cleanly there. Freedom, after prolonged captivity, is not immediate ease. It is disorientation mixed with relief, grief mixed with appetite, exhaustion mixed with distrust. The body arrives before the mind believes it. Doors still sound dangerous. Raised voices still pull the nerves tight. Sleep does not become innocent simply because a state line has changed. Philadelphia offered safety, but safety is only the first mercy. The deeper work begins after. The girls were taken in through abolitionist circles connected to black churches and anti-slavery organizers. There they encountered something Blackwood had denied them from the start: structured learning, reading, writing, numbers not used as instruments of ownership, speech not constantly measured for punishment. For many former slaves, literacy was not merely education. It was reclamation. The right to record oneself after years of being recorded by others. By October 1857, Emma was reportedly writing simple sentences. Grace advanced more slowly, but proved relentless in memory work, especially when recounting names, routes, and plantation patterns. They were no longer only survivors of Blackwood. They were becoming witnesses, capable of transmitting method. That is what makes their story more dangerous than a simple escape narrative. They did not merely flee. They converted experience into instruction. In 1858, accounts associated with anti-slavery meetings in the North began referring, sometimes vaguely, sometimes directly, to 2 young women from Georgia whose knowledge of plantation structure had helped others move. They advised on patrol habits, on how domestic workers heard things field hands did not, and field hands saw things domestic workers could not, on why planning must be divided, on why the old, the ill, and children had to be considered first, not last, on why symbolic defiance means little if it leaves the most vulnerable behind. That is mature political intelligence, and it came from girls whom the slave system had considered property. One cannot tell this honestly without pausing over the accusation it makes against the so-called civilized order of the South. The plantation had schools of a kind, schools of obedience, silence, fatigue, and hierarchy. Emma and Grace graduated from that ugliness with more strategic clarity than their owners ever possessed. Once beyond Georgia, they used that clarity not for spectacle, not for self-glorification, but for transfer. They taught others how oppressive systems think. That is one of the highest forms of resistance, not merely surviving a machine, but describing its gears so others can jam them. By 1860, according to later testimony attached to abolitionist memory, routes and methods linked loosely to the Blackwood escape had informed multiple additional flights from coastal plantations. Such claims cannot always be counted with perfect certainty. Oppressive archives are good at counting bales, poor at counting liberated lives. But the pattern matters. Knowledge moved. Blackwood did not remain a single event, it became precedent. And that is the point history must not soften. Too often, people prefer stories of slavery that end in pity. Pity is cheap. Pity lets the listener feel humane without confronting structure. This story demands more. It demands recognition that the enslaved were not simply crushed people waiting for moral progress to arrive from elsewhere. Many were analysts, organizers, couriers, codemakers, logisticians, and witnesses trapped inside a system that feared their intelligence because it depended on denying it. Emma and Grace stand in that record as prosecuting evidence. Evidence against Josiah Blackwood, who profited from captivity and called it order. Evidence against Silas Morehouse, whose treatment of Ruth on January 14, 1856, helped expose the plantation beyond repair. Evidence against Sheriff Talbot and the county machinery that answered human flight with dogs, warrants, and euphemism. Evidence against every neat ledger that valued buildings, gates, and grain more carefully than women, children, and grief. By the time the nation stumbled toward war, the girls from Blackwood had already delivered their verdict in the only language the plantation could not fully suppress. Action remembered precisely. That is why their legacy should not be wrapped in sentiment. It should be kept sharp. They were not only children of the slave South, they were among its clearest witnesses. And witnesses, once they learn how to name the crime, become harder to bury than the criminals ever expect.